Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest.
What's up, Half-Lifers?
Hey.
Don't you hey me.
Just sitting here in cold storage.
I'll drain your life from you.
Okay, Pat.
You can call me Pat, or you can call me Jory.
That sounds more like a Jory thing, but you seem like a Pat.
Thank you, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
She didn't strike me as that terrible of a person. I'm not even sure if she was real.
Or if she was stuck with them in Half-Life.
Or she was real for the first part and then became not real afterward.
A bomb will do that to you.
There's no Half-Life after that. It's the end of life.
Because, yeah, suppose if the shockwave killed them, then they're all in Half-Life. But if they were all ripped to pieces, or had brain damage like the other guy, whose name escapes me, well, then they're all dead. And
Right.
This is all in Runsitter's head or in Joe's head. Or, you know what? I'll front load it. It could be Runsitter in Half-Life, or it could be Joe on an acid trip, or on some sort of high from drugs, hallucinating to all this.
I don't feel like there's enough. Well, you know what? Let's just dive into this. How about that?
Let's do it.
Adventurers, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest. All right, Slavas, give us a quick rundown of what happened last time before we do what we were just doing, which is moving into part 2.
Oh, goodness. What happens last time? Runsitter, a guy who is in charge of a big prudence company, is going to Luna under the guise of getting a lot of money for a really quick job. And the bomb explodes, killing him, or so we think. At this point, Joe is going to Des Moines for a bottle of UBIK. He believes Runsitter is reaching out to him from beyond the grave. And things start coming undone. And we are with Joe Chip as he's trying to access the mortuary where Runsitter is laying in state because they believe he's dead. People from the mortuarium in Sweden are telling him Runsitter is no good for Half-Life. He is DOA. And now he's been flown to Des Moines. Everybody's there at his wake, and Joe Chip is rushing to him. But it seems that at every corner, something is receding back in time. Not regenerating. What is the word for it?
Reverting?
Yes. Things are reverting. A timeline has changed where now Pat is married to Joe.
Yeah.
And we pick up with him on the road to Runsitter.
That was like a blip of a moment, like, oh, I'm married to Pat. No, you're not. I was married to Pat. Well, you were, and then you weren't. What? Okay.
Yeah. And then Runsitter also, wakes up, for lack of a better term, somewhere else in the middle of a speech. We have peeled back the curtain. So I'm saying in their minds, they're not sure what's going on. Whether they're all in Half-Life, we're not sure what's going on. We're not sure if Pat is doing her Jedi time trick or what. But everybody's afraid, especially Joe and Al, as we get into the story here, chapters 11, 12, and 13. Things really come undone. So
Yeah.
how did this, I guess this is going to be a silly question, but it's no other way to word it. How did this section make you feel as you read it? What emotions were evoked?
Well, I think I mentioned this last time where it was chapter 9 that was really the turning point of making me care again. Because I spent the first couple chapters okay, what's going on? And then there was a very clear dip in my engagement of, you know what? I don't actually care because I don't know why I should care. And then 9 was the tipping point at the end of the last episode where it's okay, I'm starting to piece this together. Got it. Still a lot of questions. And then chapters 11 through, 18, 19?
17.
17. It was like, okay, I'm kind of piecing this together. And then I told you just before we started recording that about a half chapter before we see Jory come back, I was like, oh, Jory's probably to blame on this because of what we saw in the beginning of the book, where
Yep.
Jory's taking over Lady Ramekin. What's her name? Felsitter?
Ella Runsitter?
Runsiter. Taking over Lady Runsiter in the Half-Life. And it's like, okay, that makes sense. And then we get this reveal of Jory basically devouring each of the other Half-Lifers, which that seems like a pretty solid fact, where it's like, okay, on the assumption that I always can't remember his name. I want to call him Ramekin, but that's not right.
Runsitter.
Runsitter.
It doesn't matter. Ramekin works too. You know why? Because we don't know where we are either. And maybe in our world, his name is Ramekin.
All right, Camus. Love it. We're here for it. So.
You know what? You want to hear a funny?
Yeah.
Not that funny, but app for this book kind of funny.
Sure.
Because I bought some ramekins this weekend.
Oh, that's the end of the story?
That's it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
What do you think?
I thought there was more. I thought you were going to tell me you made creme brulee.
Oh, no. I made eggs in them. I made eggs in them, like a reverse poaching.
Well, it can be like UBIK. You just keep adding food epilogues, and then theoretically it means something.
Exactly. As you were talking, something came to me, a question I wanted to ask you. So we both come from vastly different perspectives when it comes to fiction. And although you enjoy my kind of fiction and I enjoy your kind of fiction, why don't you care about Runsiter and his people? And parenthetical note, it's going to be a long one, like, why should I care about Kaladin, right? Because he's just a bridge guy. Who cares about him? And I get that two different genres, two different writing styles, two different everything. But these people are going through an intense, nightmarish hellscape. They don't know what's going on. That itself keeps me hooked. And now Kaladin from Way of Kings, obviously there's a deeper, longer, more fuller story, and you want to follow this man from rags to riches, from, the pits to general or captain. So obviously two different things, but where do you, in these kind of stories, start to care?
Yeah. So you're asking where the line is for engagement, mental engagement, right? And for me, something like the Cosmere has a grounding to it. There's a lack of grounding here because of the speculative nature of it, where it's like, are they in Half-Life? Are they really alive? Were they alive? Were they only in Half-Life the whole time? Is it Runsiter's idea? And it's like, that's fun in like a philosophy class to do a few experiments in and then move on with my life. That doesn't change, or that doesn't keep me engaged for, I know this isn't a long piece, right? Like it's actually quite short, but there wasn't enough of a hook at the front end for me to go, okay, I care. Whereas like the front end of, and I know to your point, it's not a one-to-one, right? They're two very different genres. If this was the length of, what's something longer that we read?
City in the City.
Yeah, fine, sure. City in the City, right? So if this was even as long as City in the City, I think that it would have had more play, because I mean, I certainly like this so much more than City in the City, which I'm not sure if you're just getting my goat by using that as an example, or you just came to you.
It just came to me. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Or even like The Exorcist, right? Like where it's like, it's a bit of a longer book. I didn't want to say it because it was a very long book, and I could feel even in part 5, I was like, okay, like this is long, but like something about the book, like really, I was in it for the first 4 parts, and then halfway through part 5, I started to feel like, oh, there's a bit of a drag here, and I don't know why. So I didn't want to use that as like an example either. So
yeah,
anyway,
I felt that was too long of an example.
Yeah. So City in the City, fine. Like it's novel length, right? Where PKD would have time to unpack the scenarios of what's going on, and even like I would have even probably enjoyed, 17 chapters, and then it breaks out, and we follow Runsiter in an earlier part in his life, and we follow Pat in an earlier part in her life, and like you just get 4 seemingly unique perspectives that lead up until this.
What you're talking about is something more cyclical, if you will, where we're talking about present day Runsitter in 1992, possibly in Half-Life, possibly somewhere else, but through a flashback or through just an abrupt break, just to keep up with the insanity of the story, we go to Runsitter's childhood or something and to get a couple of that, and then wham, we're back into something else.
Yeah, that would have been doable. I think part of it too was like I started to let the mental engagement settle into 1992, and so like when it jumps into like we don't know what's going on, I'm like, okay, well I didn't care beforehand, so why am I going to care when it's even scrambling it more so? Like, yes, I feel for the characters of like, I'm sorry you're going through this. I don't know what's going on, but I think I just don't have buy-in, not in like that this isn't in reality, because that's not a relevant statement, but like Joe seemed like a really interesting character, and I feel like he changed, or maybe like the method on which he had his challenges changed, because like we see a lot of, hey, I don't have money for that in the front end of the book, and then after that it's like we only see that scattered about, and not that you need to replay it over and over and over again, but I don't know, he became more of a detective in the second half, and in the first half he's a bum, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so where's the arc? He just stops being a bum and becomes
Yeah,
this guy who's on
yeah.
track. And is it because he got his ass kicked by the death of Runsitter, and he's like, holy crap, I'm the next guy in line. I got to do something.
See, I didn't
I can't
believe
just sit
that
around.
though, because like I think it's a fair statement to say, because like death shocks people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it seemed like he kind of knew some of the other interlopers. What's the word that he uses?
I think interlopers. I
Is
think
it
he used that word.
that I word? Inertials.
Inertials. Well, see, interloper is somebody who's involved in where they're not wanted, I guess. So I guess interlopers.
I mean, I think that also works. Love when you stumble on a word that fits, that you're like, that's not what I meant, but it works.
Inertials. So they're interlopers, they're inertials, and it's Runsitter's retinue of testers and workers and all sorts of other
Yeah,
technicians.
retinue's like a group, right? Like a set of people. Yeah, probably sounds better in Russian.
Maybe. I don't know.
Group of starved people who can't even make vodka from potatoes anymore.
Because there's
right?
no more potatoes.
Retinue. That's
retinue. Yep.
But the Russian version. Yeah.
It's an old Soviet word. And Mother Russia, retina you.
Yeah. There you go.
That was a stretch. I'm sorry.
There you go.
That was horrific.
It is an evening hour. Anyway, so I was saying, it seemed like Joe knew the inertials at least a little more than we understood, like his emotional connection to them. Like they weren't all new. They were not all new characters. Pat was the only new character, right?
Yeah.
But Pat is the one who got most of the time, and she didn't even have enough time that we cared about her. It was just like, you're married. You're not married. You were married, but you're not married. Okay?
Well, here's the thing. He knows some of the inertials because he's the tester. Yeah. CC or GG Abrams is the guy in the field scouting these guys and girls.
Mm-hmm.
Joe tests them and sends them off to Runsitter. So a lot of these people have worked together for a long time.
Yes.
And Joe knows them. And here Pat is the outlier, where he even says she's dangerous after the test, because she shows him what she can do in the middle of her test. And then she tries to kill him.
Bazongas and all.
And she seems to be working with Hollis, the people who hired a Runsitter and his team. But we don't know if Hollis is the bad guy. Because, again, everything is so up in the air. He gets a ticket driving to a drugstore. And on the ticket, there's a message from Runsitter.
Yep.
It ends abruptly, and then it picks up in the drugstore again over a bottle of medicine, or UBIK specifically, right? So all of this is so crazy. And I feel like Pat is supposed to, this is going to sound weird, but I don't know how else to say it. Pat is supposed to be some sort of grounding. This is totally Slava analyzing this book. But the grounding is not a good grounding, because she's the one that's always the same. Mysterious, she is aloof, and when she interacts with them, she's apathetic about their plight, or so it seems. And then she tries to kill Joe. Her and
Yeah.
Jory are like the bad guys, but they seem the only thing that's constant throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. As I'm like thinking through this question and explaining a bunch of side quest items, I think that the issue with buy-in for a book like this is that I don't care about the plot and I don't care about the characters, so it's hard for me to care. Like I need one. I need one of those two to be true because I can think back to some books where I'm like, "Oh, the plot's interesting, the characters aren't though." And then I can think back to a bunch of stories where it's like the characters are interesting, but the plot's kind of like, "Meh." So, like I really need one of
Okay.
those to hit before and the thing is like I appreciate the surrealism that's taking place here, but it's not enough to make me go, I'm going to recommend this book
Gotcha.
as a top recommendation. Now, if someone tells me that they want a book that's just out of this world, I'm going to go Roadside Picnic or UBIK. Like, these are just two
Fair.
books that are so wacky that, like, they fit that bill. But,
Right.
yeah.
And I think what you just said actually answers why I enjoy this book. It's the plot. Now, I know the plot is not intricate, but because of the surrealism, because
Mm-hmm.
of the weirdness, which I really like in novels, as
Mm-hmm.
much as I
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
something that's more put together, if you will, I like weird shit like this. So I like the plot. When I started this discussion asking you, well, why don't you care about these people? They're all going through this horrible nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what kept me in the book, is my attachment to the characters. I was interested in what's happening to Joe on the staircase as Pat is belittling him and leading him to his death. But I wasn't like, oh gosh, I hope Joe lives. So the characters are kind of just there. But the plot really keeps me interested in this book. Even though I read it twice now,
Mm-hmm.
and now I know what happens. The first time I read it, I was like, holy crap, this is the best thing ever. As far as this kind of genre goes. And that kind of shines more light on your perspective for me, so that helps why you don't care.
I think that and this will come into how I rate the book at the end, but honestly, I think that it would have been sort of like a redemption quality if there was, let's say, 3 more chapters where we get some more time with Lady Runciter talking about her fighting Jory earlier on, and
Mm-hmm.
then like creating UBIK, because like we have these epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters which are like advertisements for UBIK, which is great, but like I just needed a little more, just a touch more. And this isn't even like I know that for the regular listeners, this probably sounds like, oh, it's his normal complaint about not having enough world building, and it's like it is, but it isn't. This is a short piece. It's 17 chapters, and if I had just a little more to tie it back to the beginning so that on the second read through I can go, "Oh, interesting," because of Lady Runciter's epiphanies that she shares with Joe near the end, I can
Yeah.
go back and look at each of the epigraphs and go, "Oh, there's like more here," for it to be more obvious as opposed to like me needing to exert a lot of energy. And maybe this is part of the answer too, where it's like I don't trust the author enough that if I exert the emotional energy to do the detective work as the reader, that I'm going to get a payoff.
Huh. Okay.
Right? So like if that's my perspective, then why would I exert the energy to, for the unknown of like a not sure payoff?
Okay. I'm going to let that stand by itself because I think you've explained yourself well. My question to your previous point, do you think it would have been more interesting if the last, even if it's chapter 17, if the last scene wasn't Runciter wherever he was holding a coin of Joe Chip,
Yeah.
but he was back talking to Ella and it was just kind of like a time loop thing? Or something had
Mm.
changed? So,
Mhm.
maybe enough of it changed where he was like, what the hell's going on? More than like, oh, did I just dream this? But literally, something in his world was altered enough to screw with him. But he was back with Ella going, hey, we got an inertial who disappeared. And an inertial who could change his face, because that
Oh,
was
that would
part of
be
it.
interesting. I mean,
You know?
yeah, that might be like minimum viable story, right? Like just adding that extra scene. But I think that takes away from her wanting to go into reincarnation.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
it would need to happen before the reincarnation stuff.
Okay. So now that you've explained yourself a little bit in more detail, and we've had these conversations maybe 3 or 4 times, and each time I get a little bigger piece of it. So I understand exactly where you're coming from, and that helps. That helps. I'll still suggest books like this.
Oh, and you should. One of the reasons that I really enjoy this podcast is like, look, I'm never going to walk up to a shelf and read the back of UBIK and go, this strikes me as something I should pick up. Right? Like, that's just not going to happen. And so, if it's like when you're in school where you're like, oh, you can have a conversation with almost anybody because you read Shakespeare and you read To Kill a Mockingbird and you read, the Greek gods, the Greek mythology, right? Because of school. And it's like, so you
Yep.
can have a general conversation, even if you don't remember the details. And that's what this kind of is to me, where it's like, yeah, I don't have to like every book. But you know what? Being more well-read allows me to synthesize the world that I live in a little bit more. And we can have different conversations. I think last episode was pretty unique. And then also
Yeah.
the episode that we did for Warbreaker with Casey.
Yeah.
Because authors offering us new stories allow us to think about the world differently. Even if it's just entertainment, there's some sort of famous quote that says, people who read live 1,000 lives, and people who don't live one.
Yeah. I agree. That's why I love reading. And I took a long break from it while I was in seminary and read only academic books,
Heavy
but
theology.
heavy theology book. But there were times interspersed between that, especially in New York, I discovered there's Audible. I'm like, hey, I read all this stuff for school. There's no Audible books, on the Mishnah. And if there are, they're not the ones that are going to be
Yeah.
anyway helpful for my studies. But I could read this. And so I started reading Stephen King. I started rereading Philip K. Dick. And a lot of the books that I've suggested, I started rereading then on Audible. So that's not entirely true. But now that I've been out of seminary for a while and doing this podcast, I'm reading fiction all the time. In the last few weeks, I finished a Will White book, a Brandon Sanderson book. I'm starting another Brandon Sanderson book. And I read half of Langoliers, which is part of the 4 Past Midnight collection of novellas, which we'll be doing in a few months here. So I'm reading a lot. And I'm reading like 3 different genres. And to your point, it's interesting to be immersed in each world. And UBIK is very different than Warbreaker, and Warbreaker is very different than the Langoliers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because if I talk to somebody who's read Stephen King, like Casey's dad, for example, he loves Stephen King. He's going through our It series, loving it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said it's great.
Oh, nice.
They've been following the It episodes.
That's fun.
Who knew that they were Stephen King fans? It happened to be at a lunch when we talked about it. I let it slip because they're close enough friends where I don't feel awkward saying it.
Sure.
Hey, I have a podcast. Casey piped up about reading fantasy books, right? And the conversation was very fluid, so not a lot of it was connected, but there's enough sinew there.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, hey, if you like fantasy, do you like Brandon Sanderson? Hey, how about you come on a podcast? All that to say is that would have never come about if we didn't read. Like you, me, and Casey didn't read just a ton of stuff all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, that gets into my point of like when you're going through school and you read To Kill a Mockingbird, you read the Greek myths, you read Romeo and Juliet, and it's like you can have a conversation. I could have a conversation with Casey's dad because I've read it now. I'd never read it before. Even though I don't love this book, it's like middle of the road for me. Like we know that one side of my scale is I hate The City and the City, and then I love fantasy books, and PKD has like some interesting thought-provoking stuff, especially for like when this was written. Like this is genius if you understand and like can appreciate that this was written in like the 70s, 69.
69.
I think. Yeah, 69. It's enjoyable even though I know that I don't like love it. Because if I decide, oh, I remember like Roadside Picnic. I haven't read it a second time yet, but it's on my like mental like, oh yeah, I'm going to go back and read that again. Right?
Yep.
Like because that's, again, one of my favorite books that I've read from your suggestions, and it is up there now too, where it's just like, oh, this was really good.
Casey's dad, when he was telling me he's really enjoying the It episodes, he said that the town Derry really reminds him of his hometown. And I was like,
Uh-oh.
that is unfortunate.
Did he used to have a brother?
No, but there was a lot of child murders.
Oof. Okay.
Yeah.
Woof. It was a tough time in the 80s, I guess.
In small town America in the 80s, man.
Yeah.
But listen, I lived in a medium-sized town in America, and 2 kids died on my street. So.
Was it Dahmer? You can tell.
No. Sadly, it was self-inflicted. But.
Woof.
So it's everywhere. But I like that. I like that he's enjoying the book, and that he's able to connect, even if it's a little bit macabre, where it sounds like it as we're describing it. It sounds a little bit macabre.
Yeah.
But it's nice they can be able to connect it to other stuff. And he's a Stephen King fan. There's books that I read that are not about child murderers or demonic clowns. They have a quality of reminiscence to them, like where I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this from my childhood. This thing that's happened in this book sort of bringing back a memory.
Like the Bernstein Bears?
Yes, exactly.
That's what you're talking about, right? Books from childhood, Bernstein Bears.
Yes. Well, no, not at all.
Okay.
Because did you forget the country that I came from? And
Yeah. But I don't know how to say it.
What kind of children's stories?
You were reading old Gothic fairy tales where at the end of Hansel and Gretel, they both die. They don't escape.
Or the girl that puts on the red shoes and never stops dancing, so she had to cut off her feet. Like,
yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm never putting on shoes ever again. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. Or Krampus.
Right. But anyway, I've gotten us off track. It's good to understand where you're coming from, because that way, if I come across a book that's speculative like this, but it has an immersive world where we can get lost in it for 5-6 episodes instead of 2. Now I know that putting that on the production schedule.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of Joe, because this is the world's greatest transition, I thought it was fun irony at the end when Runsiter sees Joe on the money. And it's just like, oh. And so there's some sort of connection between the Half-Life state of existence and the present world. I just don't see enough evidence that Runsiter is dead or in Half-Life at all. Like, there's clearly like a gap here. I'm sure that if you spelled out a few details, like, you could build a case for it, but I really think Runsiter's alive.
Well, then PKD has accomplished the task he set out. Well, that's what's so great about this book. You can think that, but the counter argument is just as valid. Well, of course there's overlap between these two worlds because it's all a dream sequence. It's all a Half-Life hallucination. And that's what's so fun about this kind of stuff. This is why I love it.
When I play out the hypothetical that Runsiter's in a Half-Life also, why isn't he just talking to his wife? That's what he enjoys doing.
That's a good question.
If he was in a Half-Life, he would have a better conversation. He'd be one-to-one with his wife again. And so, like, by the negative that he's not on a one-to-one with his wife again,
okay,
because she wouldn't go towards the womb of the red light if her husband was there. She wouldn't have a reason to.
That's a good point.
So
that's a very good point.
That's why Runsiter's alive, right? Like, he's
I'll buy
alive.
that for $1.
Yeah, a Joe Chip dollar.
Yes,
great.
Only a Joe Chip dollar.
We don't accept any other kind of money here, so no wooden nickels for you. But that's why it's like that one clue to me is like, they're not in the same state of existence. Even if it's the reverse where he's dead and they're alive, which I don't think is, like, that seems even harder to prove.
Right, because
honestly.
That goes against your point.
Well, it goes against my point, but, like, it goes against the whole story. Like, at the beginning when he's trying to talk to his wife and he's going to whatever, like, I mean, I could make the argument for it, but I think it's just a lot weaker than the argument that he survived and they're all in Half-Life.
I think I agree with you that he's alive. I think I'm uncertain, and I'm happy that I'm uncertain about whether they're all dead or in Half-Life. But here's the thing. If Runsiter is dead, and this is Joe Chip and Don and Al Debbie, I think her name is, they're all in Half-Life. Runsiter's completely dead. They're all in Half-Life, and they're all having a hallucination. Wouldn't it? No, it wouldn't. Because if they were
Yeah,
in Half-Life hallucinating, they wouldn't hallucinate Runsiter with Ella looking at a Joe Chip dollar.
right,
So
right. And they
I
wouldn't
think you've
hallucinate,
broken the book.
and they wouldn't hallucinate going back in time because that.
Yeah.
Yes, Joe starts to understand he has a sense of power in the Half-Life, but like even though he has a sense of power, we don't see him flex it enough. Like he's learning his magic system at the end of the book and the story cuts off. So like we also don't see any evidence that anyone who's died and like didn't make it to Half-Life can be resurrected per se simply by imagining them or like perceiving that they're around. Right? Like when they die, they're dead.
I think I disagree with you there. You got me on Runsitter, but their inability to use their powers or their regression, states of reversion, I think that's all part of the nebulous state that they're in, where they themselves don't know what's going on. And the only thing that is constant is Pat and Jory, the one who's messing with them all, and then Runsitter outside of the Half-Life world trying to contact them.
Jory is a constant. UBIK is a constant. Joe and Runsitter are constants of sorts. I think Runsitter is more of a constant on the outside. Joe's a constant on the inside. Post bomb explosion. Ella is like a pillar, but we don't get enough time with her. And I'm not actually sure that Pat's real.
Could Pat be a manifestation of one of Jory's tricks?
It's possible. But if there's a way to interact between Half-Life and real life, as we see at the end with Joe like affecting money itself in the living world, then it seems reasonable to me that there's a way to have Jory manifest in some capacity with his powers to present a Pat-like character to guide them into this state of the bomb exploding, the big incident.
And that's another thing I was going to bring up. The bomb is kind of what sets everything into motion. That's why we're having the conversation. Because if the book was just about a couple of people, well, 11, going to a lunar colony and getting ambushed by an enemy, okay, and then their adventures back to Earth. But everything before the bomb explosion is safely assumed to be in the real world, apart from the crap that Pat does with Joe. So that's what throws another monkey wrench into the gears.
Yeah.
Is this Joe in Half-Life imagining all of it? Or is it Joe in Half-Life reliving his death in some sort of dreamlike state, and then the rest of it is him in Half-Life?
We don't have enough examples that you can relive your death in Half-Life because Ella never mentions it.
No.
And she's one of our key characters, and Jory never mentions it. I think it's reasonable to say that you don't get the opportunity to relive your death in Half-Life.
But it's fun to speculate.
And maybe this is why I don't do good with speculative fiction, because I just keep looking at the clues presented to me and I go, even everyone who's listening now, like, okay, I took the negative, like Runsiter and his wife are on opposite sides of existence, regardless of what those two existences are. And so I took the negative, and it's like, well, because of that, then one of them is alive and one of them's dead. Because if they were on the same side, then they would spend time with each other because they still love each other. Period. And then it's like just logical progressions from there. Again, a little hard to prove, but I think that it's reasonable to extrapolate the story logic that was handed to us.
Because Joe allegedly talks to Ella, he might be in Half-Life.
Allegedly.
But you've convinced, everything else is up for grabs, but I think you've convinced me that Runsitter is alive and the rest of them are in Half-Life. Everything that's in Half-Life, I think, falls apart no matter how good your logic is or how you apply the evidence you have in world in text. It falls apart because PKD, as far as we know, wanted this to be confusing AF.
So I have a follow-up question then about PKD. Is he actually got his brain in Half-Life somewhere
Oh, I hope so.
under some sort of pseudonym authorship. I really hope he didn't write City in the City in Half-Life.
That'd be the only explanation. China Mayville is Philip K. Dick. Folks, you heard it here first. Yeah.
A better compliment has never been given.
To China Mayville.
That's right. Yes, that was the implication.
Okay. I'm just
didn't feel like I needed to spell it out, but because we're talking about a book of speculative fiction where the audience gets to make their assumptions about everything.
Yeah. Dick makes no effort to definitively state which interpretations, the ones we waxed philosophical about, or the ones that are kind of out there in the zeitgeist of Philip K. Dick analysis and books and other fans. He makes no effort to state which of these interpretations is correct. Now, obviously, these interpretations came after he wrote the book. Some of them came after he died. But I think an author can safely assume the questions that might be asked in world or about the world, and he doesn't answer any of them in this book.
It'd be pretty weird if the assumptions about the story were given before the book was published.
That's not what I meant, but yes.
It seems in line with the book.
Touche.
That'd be a great PR stunt to release a bunch of press release stuff about this book, and then everyone's like, I want to get my hands on this book. And they're like, it doesn't exist yet. And they go, what? You're welcome. He should have hired me for marketing.
And if you were in Half-Life in the 1960s, he could have. So I guess the point is that human perception of reality must be questioned at every turn. And I stole that. That's not Slava's great conclusion to this book. I stole that from an online source that's trustworthy. It's an organization that does book analysis and summaries and puts them out there for like classes and teachers and people like us. So their conclusion is exactly what I just read. The point, rather, is arguably that human perception of reality must be questioned at every turn. Now that seems in line with what PKD said publicly.
Yeah, that's what he's shooting for in this.
Yeah.
But I'd say if and we won't go fully down this track and this rabbit trail, but like phenomenology asks this question of like, can you trust what your senses see and take in? The data that your senses take in, is it trustworthy? If yes, why? If no, why? So, maybe PKD was a phenomenologist.
He was definitely on amphetamines when he wrote this, so
I was going to say,
or so we're told,
some sort of drug. He was busy trusting his senses, even though they were in states of alternative reality.
That's for sure. You said in the beginning this ending was not satisfying. And that's fine. But was it the ending that you expected? And I don't mean that you expected a bad ending. I'm asking something between the lines there. Did you expect there to be no resolution? Because you read a couple of these kind of books that I've suggested. Did you expect it to kind of be like, to kind of end abruptly? You didn't expect, Runseter to give you all the answers and then all of a sudden, oh, Joe Chip is actually dead.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect. I guess I try not to have expectations with books like this because I just don't know what's going to happen. What I did expect, and I think I mentioned this earlier, was that Jory was involved due to storytelling 101 of like, you introduced a character at the beginning that seems like he has more play than we're being told about. He hasn't come back, and I'm wondering why. Oh, there he is. So that part I did expect, but the way it ended, where there's this crossover between Half-Life and Joe Chip affecting something in reality, kind of puts this into some sort of hyperloop, if you will, because Joe's in the past and he has to like regain momentum to the future / present. He has the opportunity to affect the past, and because he has the opportunity to affect the past, it did affect the past.
Isn't that a red herring? Like the fact that they're in future or past 1992 or 1934, all that seems like a red herring. Because if they're in Half-Life, if we're to believe that Runseter is alive and they're in Half-Life, they're just in a dream state, just like you and I would be, where you're flying in a car on the moon, and then next you're riding a gazelle through the city, that you live in.
Through the city and the
dreams
city.
are weird. And I'm using something very, out there as an example, a hyperbole as an example, to underscore that they don't know what's going on. The fact that they're getting pulled over by cops who are giving them messages, and drugstores are appearing, and Ella's appearing, and then Debbie's dead and shriveled up, and all these weird things are happening where they drive a car to the funeral home where Runsetter is. By they, I mean Joe.
Mm-hmm.
They come out, it's a different car. Oh, I mean, that's the airport. When he drives to the airport to trade the car in to get a flight, comes out, it's a completely different car. All that seems to prove your point even more so, and not your latest one, but the one you made originally, is that Runsetter is alive, trying to communicate with his team who have all been killed on Luna, and this just came to me. Runsetter is the one with the augmented body.
Yep.
So it would seem that he would survive a shockwave from a bomb, while regular humans just died.
Yeah. Well, I propose a new ending that Joe Chip pulls a Runsetter by pre-planning money made in his own image, and he's not actually a drug addict in the same way that we think he is, but he knew that there would come a day where he'd need to deliver a message to Runsetter, and so he decided to make money, which was his biggest issue that we're aware of, in his own likeness. To then
cut and print.
To then hand to his own
No pun
boss.
intended, but cut and print.
That's right. Yes.
What makes me like the ending, to me, there is a certain type of beauty in the lack of finality in this book. And I got that quote from a woman who was doing a podcast with her husband, and they had a critic on who was part of the committee that chose this book to be one of the greatest books since 1929 or something like that, or 1960s. I forget exactly how they broke up the time periods. And she said that there's beauty in the lack of finality. And not every book that ends abruptly can be described like that. But to me, I think, because I like the plot, because I like the story that's being told, I think there's a certain type of beauty in the ending where we're not really sure what the hell just happened.
It's like Inception at the end where the top is spinning and you're like, did it fall? Did it not fall? Because it cuts too soon.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah. Movie edition.
Although, funny enough, watched another Philip K. Dick overview, and they've mentioned a lot of his books have become movies, but UBIK hasn't. Although like 4 or 5 directors have played around with the idea of making a movie, and they cut to one director, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, it would be fun to make this movie, but so many movies have borrowed from it that at this point, it'll be redundant to make a whole movie that just is UBIK in film form.
Who borrowed from it? Like what? Who?
I don't know. You want the guy's email?
Yeah, I want to talk to management.
Not the plot, but the ideas that are presented in the book have been covered by other movies. Inception, Memento. They didn't name these books or movies. I'm naming them. So that's what the director was getting at least in the 35 seconds he got an airtime in this documentary.
Yeah, but that's a cop-out answer. Like, as someone who's directed before, like, the beauty of directing is you and me can both make Taming of the Shrew, and it's going to be a different play.
Yeah.
Because the directorial piece of it is the different part of it. So, like, if you just go, well, it's been done, then you don't understand storytelling. And, like, I'm not even abashed about that. It's like, you could go with what's his guy's name? Robert McKee. You could go with Robert McKee and his idea that it's not Robert McKee. It's Joseph Campbell, that every story is the same story. The Man of 1,000 Faces or something like that, where he paraphrase summary is that Campbell believes that there's only one story to be told and it's just told a bunch of different ways. Clearly this guy doesn't fall into that camp, but yeah, that just seems like a cop out. Like if you think that, then you just, man, I'm going to tear into this unknown person. Then you're going to tell me it's like Scorsese or something like that.
No, it's not.
It's like, you just lack creativity, right? Because like, there's a real beauty in like play directors, just to use the same example, of them redoing Taming of the Shrew. And one time it's a Western, and one time it's, Victorian, and one time it's in space. And it's like, they're retelling the story and it's different, but it's the same story. We know it's Taming of the Shrew. Lion King is Hamlet, But that seems so unique because it's like, who has talking lions? And then like, why is this one lion uncle like killing the father of his nephew? Oh, it's Hamlet. It's a retelling of Hamlet. So yeah, that seems like a cop out answer.
And I think even if UBIK has been borrowed from, not directly from the plot, but the ideas that Dick describes or talks about or presents.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, like those movies that take place within the movie, it's only like 13 hours of time, but it's a long movie because there's like minute by minute changes. Make it a long form movie and give me 2 hours of when the bomb goes off and then everything that happens in this weird reality. And then, to use your idea, interweave the stuff before the bomb goes off. That's a retelling of UBIK that I think would be mildly interesting for most, very, very, very interesting for weirdos like me.
So you got me thinking now of like movies that pull from similar things, and Christopher Nolan's Tenet, which didn't really get a lot of play in theaters, I'd say is actually very close in premise for some specific pieces of UBIK. The piece in particular is this reversing of time. And like the premise of the movie is that someone from the future is sending back weapons to the past for them to be used. It was actually pretty good, but it didn't get any play because it was the start of the pandemic. But the movie ends where there's two timelines taking place. There's the forward timeline and the back timeline, and the main character's in both. Because eventually at the end he goes back in time, and so you're basically watching the moments of the movie earlier that you don't get the reveal that it's him. He's going back and doing those moments that you already saw.
I like it a lot already. I haven't even seen it, but now I want to see it.
It's worth a watch. It's good.
Okay. Yeah. Well, should we land this 1931 Cessna? Were there Cessnas in 1931?
Don't know about that. Should we drive this Ford A model off the side
Into
of a cliff?
wall. Yes, yes, we should.
Same.
Let's end our misery, because I feel Jory creeping up the stairs.
Girding your loins.
No, not doing that. Although, speaking of Jory's loins, did you notice that? And maybe this is a far-fetched connection. So the first guy who disappears, the inertial who disappears in the beginning of the book, he's able to change his face.
Yeah.
Jory is an amalgamation of a bunch of people that he's apparently eaten.
Yeah.
Or have interacted with.
Yeah.
So that's a fun little connection. But Jory is a monster.
Yes.
Because his face is falling off, his eyes are different, his nose is different, his ears are disproportionate. So that's something for not this episode, but I thought it was fun.
Yeah, that was a little weird. I was trying to, whenever I see creatures like that, I always try and think back to like, what D&D character is that like? And I couldn't think of one off the top of my head.
And therefore you lost interest and stopped the book.
No, I finished the book. I always finish. Well, except for, what's that book that I've complained about before in the past? The Inn, I think? Or The Wandering Inn. Wandering Inn. Where I was like 30 chapters in, and I was like, all this main character is doing is whining, and I just can't do this anymore. But I've had it on good recommendation that all of the books after that, the character actually wisens up and doesn't do that anymore. It's actually a really good series.
Oh.
But like, the first book is actually just such a drag. To the point where the author is, I guess, rewriting book one. I didn't look it up. I just trusted my brother's friend. You know your first book is bad when you're like, oh, everything else was good. And look, good for them. I think you should do that. If you've noticed that your first book is like just that bad, then, and like that's the stopping point for people getting into your series, then yeah, it deserves a rewrite.
Absolutely. Well, this was fun to read and to talk about. I'm glad that I've gotten you to read 3 weird books that you liked. By weird, I mean speculative sci-fi.
I mean, the only book you've suggested that I didn't like as we know, was China Mayville's. Everything else was fine or great.
Here's the thing about preferences and tastes is we can get along as friends and not have the same tastes. I am not at all offended that even if you hated this book,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be offended. Even if I loved City in the City because it was what my mom read to me when I was a child,
Oh my gosh.
and you just shat on it,
Yeah.
I would not be offended because, like, I would expect the same thing from you. If I read The Way of Kings and said, this is just the biggest pile of dog doo-doo ever,
Yeah.
I don't expect you to cry about it. I'm like, well, I'm not a
No, but
fan
it's gonna be tough for you when we read the other 4. So
Why did it get worse?
no. If you didn't like the first one, it's a
Oh,
slog.
right,
It's a
right,
slog
right,
to keep
right.
going
No,
through a
no, I'm
series.
picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
What we can't seem to put down is this episode. So,
Final thoughts, and then we'll rate the book and call it a day. We haven't really done any books that we've hated outside of the City in the City. And this is something we talked about briefly when we were dialoguing about romantasy. So we need to start adding in books that we either have both not read or we know that we're actually going to dislike, because otherwise this is just a self-aggrandizing podcast a little bit.
yeah. Well, the first year can be self-aggrandizing. Then we got to get serious.
First year's over, bud.
Oh, well, then what the hell are we doing? Fourth Wing next week.
Hey, let's go. I'll call Allison after this.
Sexy soul dragons. And listen, when I explained the plot of that book to Jess, she said, that's like that weird episode of Rick and Morty when the dragons have sex with each other.
Yeah, and then you sent me the
Wookiee.
video.
Yeah, I was like,
Mammoth.
whatever.
Yeah. All right, rating system. World, plot, characters. Or characters, plot, world. 1 out of 5. 1 is terrible, hate the book. 5 is it's perfect, it doesn't need any changes. And then anything between 1 and 5, you have to explain the changes you'd want to see.
Okay. So world and plot, I'm going to give a 5 for the reasons that I mentioned.
5 and 5. Love it.
I love these weird types of plots, these weird stories. The world, because it's this mysterious, dreamlike, crazy hellscape, I love it. And I'm giving it a 5 because for the time it was written, for the genre and the length, and the author knowing what he was going through, this is fantastic work. The characters, I'm going to give them a 4 because I think they could have been more interesting. There could have been that backstory idea that you mentioned, which I think is fantastic. I actually, props to you. A+, here's a cookie, a star, whatever.
Bottle of whiskey
Really,
somewhere in the future or the past or both.
listen, stop living in a draconian state. Or, listen, find me a liquor store within 200 miles of your house that ships or sells gift cards or has a website. You will have 3 bottles of whiskey, I guarantee you. One for your birthday, one for the IT services, and one for your wedding. Anyway.
Oh, that's funny.
So the characters could have used a little bit of more backstory. And I think, again, your idea, which would have added minimum amount of pages and maybe not even that much depth to the characters, but just knowing a little bit more of their interactions in the world, a little bit more of...
Little bow tie,
exactly. So 4 for the characters, 5 for the other 2. And my final thoughts, there's a lot of beauty in the finality that the ending offers us or doesn't offer us. What about you? Let's go with world, plot, characters, same way.
World gets a 5. Like, if you're going to have something this unique, you get a 5. You just do. Because creativity is really, really hard. Even though I have questions about the world, still a 5. Plot, on the other hand, gets a 4 for the reasons I've stated earlier in the episode. It's too ethereal to allow me to engage with it at the level that I want to. Not even want to, but like that my soul or personality looks for in literature. Characters get a 4. Similar thoughts. I want to know a little more about them. I want scattered pieces throughout this that, make us not just question, but like somewhere hidden inside this piece, there's like the clues that actually reveal the truth about what happened. Was Pat real after the bomb? Was she real before the bomb? I don't know. So 5, 4, 4. 5 for the world, 4 for the plot, 4 for the characters.
All right.
That's the thing. That's the ticket.
I love it. Well, thank you for joining us today. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next literary jaunt, only on SideQuest.